very much. First of all, I'm extremely grateful for this opportunity which SSER has given me to address this audience. Uh, Surajit gave an excellent introduction to the entire area that we are discussing today. One of the things which he said at the end is the parallel between demonetization on the one hand and the lockdown on the other hand. I think the parallel consists in several respects, and one is this desire to have shock and awe tactics. That the whole idea is to, in fact, do things on a scale that would take people completely unawares and contribute through the shock and awe tactics to the building up of a cult of the personality. But the second is the complete lack of concern that both these measures and a whole lot of other measures have really shown about the ordinary working people of this country. Demonetization broke the back of the petty production sector, and this, again, the lockdown has had a very similar effect. Now, if you have a lockdown, then the government's intervention would be necessarily of two kinds. One is that during the lockdown itself, of course, both supply side as well as demand side are affected, insofar as plants don't run, factories don't run, you actually have a reduction in output. And at the same time, there's a reduction in income. But of course, the reduction on the supply side is much less significant because you can always have stocks being decumulated. The reduction on the supply side, therefore, is much less significant than the reduction on the demand side because of the income compression that such a loss of output brings about. Uh, Therefore, it is essential for the government during a lockdown to ensure that enough purchasing power is put into the hands of the ordinary people, of the ordinary working people who are deprived of income during the lockdown. And this is why large numbers of economists had been arguing throughout the period of the lockdown that please give a certain amount of money to every household for a number of months during which they can actually manage to make their purchases. Uh, but on the other hand, while the government came out with a proposal apparently of 20 lakh crores, supposedly 10% of GDP as a rescue package. A closer examination suggests that the bulk of the items were either already there in the budget and they were just kind of, put under this, or alternatively, they just meant making it easier to access credit and so on. If you look at the fiscal part of that 20 lakh crores, which is the real help that the government can actually give to distressed households and families, then you find that that came to maximum about 1.9 lakh crores, or some have even estimated to be 1.65 lakh crores, which is less than 1% of the country's GDP. Therefore, during the period of the lockdown, when the government is supposed to provide succor to the different distressed households who have lost their purchasing power, you actually found that the amount of assistance that the government gave to these households, despite the urgings of numerous economists, was really trivial. Just contrast this. Shurajit has already told us about the fiscal assistance that other countries have been given. Just contrast it with the United States under Trump. Under Trump, who's no great friend of the poor in the United States, under Trump, in the first installment, there was a $2 trillion package, which came to about 10% of the US GDP. And what is more, Trump even had a rule whereby there was a prohibition of evictions for lack of payment of rent. In India, we know that when large numbers of migrant workers could not pay their rents because they had no incomes, they actually had to trudge back home because there was no place that they could actually stay. While in the United States, there was a moratorium on the evictions of people from their places of residence for non-payment of rent during the period that they were really not accessing income. Now, notice that even though the US economy had started recovering after the lockdown, now Joe Biden, the new president, has come up with another $1.9 trillion rescue package, of which 1 trillion consists entirely of transfers to the working people. Every working person or every got $600 per month as a sheer transfer. And this is going to continue even though the US economy has started recovering, and even though much of the conservative opinion would say that now that the economy has started recovering, you better scale down the assistance that the government has to give. Uh, so if you just look at the assistance, the transfers that the US government is given to to the working people generally, then it comes to 5% of GDP under the Joe Biden's continuation of the Trump program of assistance. In India, however, as I said, the entire assistance that was given, right, the entire fiscal effort came to less than 1% of the GDP. In fact, I would bet on the fact that India's assistance from the state to the distress during the lockdown and even afterwards has been one of the lowest in the world. In fact, even in other countries, even third world countries, you actually find that there has never been such callousness which has been expressed vis-a-vis the ordinary working people. Now, this is something which is quite well known, but I want to discuss a little bit about the second way, because let us be very clear, I'm going to be arguing that even if there were no second wave, even if the effect of the lockdown were completely over, in the coming year, the distress of the people in terms of unemployment, in terms of recession in the economy would continue. And all this talk about V-shaped recovery just does not make any sense. Now, the second way, as I said, in terms of which the government can help an economy that's coming out of a lockdown, in order to even have that V-shaped recovery, is to make adequate government expenditure so that in a case in which some elements of the aggregate demand is not expected to grow as rapidly, government expenditure must play the role of actually ensuring that aggregate demand as a whole does grow. In other words, it must fulfill that gap if some element of aggregate demand does not grow adequately. Now, we know that if we have, let us assume that we're going to have a V-shaped recovery. If we have a V-shaped recovery, that would roughly bring the economy in 2021-22 to exactly the level where it was prior to the lockdown itself, which, as you know, as Shurajit said, has brought down our GDP by roughly 8%, 7.7%. So if it'll just bring the economy back to where it was before all this lockdown happened. Now, suppose it comes back to that level. Now, in that case, let us forget about net exports because we don't know what's going to happen in the world economy. Certainly, the world economy is not going to recover as rapidly and so on. Net exports will probably be lower compared to what they were, at the beginning before the lockdown began. But let's ignore that. Let's ignore net exports altogether. In which case, we have three elements: C plus I plus G. which constitute the three elements of aggregate demand. Now, consumption as a proportion of income or consumption propensity out of the income for the nation as a whole is unlikely to be as high as it was at the beginning for the simple reason that precisely because the government did not provide sufficient assistance during the lockdown, you actually found that people would have borrowed. Therefore, they have to now pay back their debts. And for doing that, they would be, even if assuming that the economy comes back to where it was, employment is where it was, people's incomes are where they were, you'd find that consumption would still suffer a cut because people would be paying back their loans. So consumption out of income would not be at the same level where it was earlier. But more important is investment. Now, what is going to happen to investment? We know that if income simply comes back to the level where it was to start with, in that case, the capacity that existed in the beginning is at most going to have the same level of utilization now as it had in the beginning. Now, when capacity utilization does not increase, and what is more, that capacity is good enough to produce the output that is now going to be produced by my assumption, in that case, there is no particular reason to add to capacity. As a result, investment almost certainly is going to take a knock. And certainly, this is apart from the fact that when it comes to the small and petty production sector, because of the disastrous effects of government policies, both through demonetization as well as through a lockdown and so on, their investments certainly are going to be nowhere near what they were at the beginning of this entire just prior to the lockdown. So it would follow that investment is going to be lower in the coming year than it was just before the lockdown began. I mean, over a comparable period. Now, if so, suppose we even assume, the accelerator would tell us that investment should be zero. But let's not take such an extreme position. Let us assume that investment is just reduced by 10% compared to the period before the lockdown. The tempo of investment is reduced by only 10%, which would basically mean that the fall in investment would be about 3% of GDP. I'm taking a very conservative figure. Gross fixed capital formation is 30% of the GDP. So 10% of that would be 3% of GDP, which would roughly, let us say, be 6 lakh crores in the coming year. Now, if you have a shortfall of 6 lakh crores, remember C plus I plus G. C is going to be less, even if the income is the same compared to what it would have been otherwise. I is certainly going to be less by at least 6 lakh crores compared to what it would have been otherwise. Therefore, G should have increased by at least 6 lakh crores in order to provide sufficient demand so that the output in the coming year would be at the same level as it was before, and therefore you would have had a V-shaped recovery. But on the other hand, let's just look at the change in G, which is being talked about. If you look at the current budget estimates, really give G to be 34 lakh crore. The total government expenditure is going to be about 34.8 lakh crores. If you let us take as our base last year's budget estimates. In other words, I'm assuming, making an extravagant assumption, that suppose last year's budget estimate level of G was actually realized, then last year's output would have been realized and not 8% lower. Okay, so let us assume that last year's output was 30.4. Last year's budget estimate of government expenditure was 30.4 lakh crores. Since last year, we have had about a 6%, 5 to 6% increase in GDP, in increase in prices. So purely to take account of prices, if last year's budget estimate of government expenditure was going to be maintained in the current year, then it would have to be at least 2 lakh crores higher, let's say 32.4 lakh crores. Now, if 32.4 lakh crores is going to be higher, as a matter of fact, it is 34.8, which means, let us say, 2.4 lakh crores additional. But as I mentioned, the fall in investment is going to be almost 6 lakh crores. Therefore, the government expenditure should have been at least 4 lakh crores higher than it is even budgeted in the current budget, which was given only last month. So it follows then that the government itself is not even believing that there is going to be a V-shaped recovery. A V-shaped recovery would have required a much larger government expenditure effort than is even budgeted in the current year's budget, which was presented only last. Because of which, again, you'd find that if there is a shortage of demand, then of course output would not be what you would not have V-shaped recovery. Output would not be at the same level as it was to start with, and therefore incomes would not be at the same level where they were to start with. Therefore, consumption would not be at the same level as in the beginning. Therefore, the multiplier effect would mean that actually the recovery would be even less than simply the fall in investment would have warranted. So you'd find that there'd be a multiplier effect of this shortage of aggregate demand, because of which the recovery would actually be far less impressive than budgeted. Certainly, it is not going to bring us back to the level when the economy was to start with, which basically means that the levels of unemployment are going to be much higher, though of course they'll be camouflaged in terms of a reduction in the employment population ratio and so on. But fundamentally, the kind of distress to which the working people of the country have been subjected is distress that is going to continue. And that being the case, the reason, I mean, the question which immediately arises is, why is the government doing this? I mean, why is it that insufficient help is being given to the working people in a period of acute distress? Mind you, even before the lockdown, even before the pandemic, you remember that the unemployment rate was higher than it had been over the last 45 years. So already you had high levels of unemployment. These have increased further. And what is more now, even the recovery from that level of unemployment is not going to be what the government promises it to be. Then why is that? Why is this? Why is this penchant for shock and awe, which actually means nothing, signifies nothing, but on the other hand doesn't help the people either? The fundamental reason, as far as I can see, is because, of course, that this is a government that is far more beholden to the vicissitudes of the whims and caprices of global finance than any previous government we have had. Of course, we have had neoliberal governments. Of course, we have had governments which have been generally concerned about the so-called confidence of the investors. But in being so concerned, they have also had a degree of discretion, a degree of smartness, if you like, in ensuring that they really don't do things in such a slapdash manner that it actually brings acute distress to the people. Distress, yes, but not the kind of distress which is now staring the Indian people in the face. And the reason, I believe, is that this government, either because it doesn't understand any economics, or alternatively, because it is far more obedient to the caprices of globalized finance, is really completely unwilling to do even what is possible, even what is possible in terms of help. Let me just give you one illustration. See, everybody during the lockdown was saying that, look, this was an opportunity. you could say that, look, this is a very exceptional circumstance and the situation is bad, and therefore we are going to enlarge the fiscal deficit. 9.5% of GDP, if you remember, is because of the fact that the revenues fell drastically, not because the expenditures rose all that much. The drastic fall in revenue pushed the fiscal deficit to 9.5%. Many people have argued that, look, during this pandemic, we can actually afford to push the fiscal deficit to 12.5%. Some have put even higher. Suppose we would have added 3% extra to the fiscal deficit. Nobody would have minded it because of the fact that even finance would have understood that the country is facing an acute crisis. And if you add 3%, then that basically would have been quite enough to provide for every household about 5,000 rupees per month of cash assistance for a period of 6 months. If the government, in other words, had actually pushed the fiscal deficit to 12.5%, which many serious ex-government economists were saying is possible, then the government could have provided 5,000 rupees per household fiscal assistance transfers per month for a period of 6 months. In other words, it was not beyond our reach. The government could easily have provided help, but it did not. It did not, maybe because either it doesn't understand economics, or alternatively, it is so confident that religious and communal divisions are going to win its votes anyway, and very callous about people's living, or additionally also because it is so scared of globalized finance, of offending globalized finance, that actually India ended up having one of the worst records in terms of fiscal assistance during the lockdown. And as I have been arguing, in terms of the post-lockdown recovery, again, its record is going to be abysmal. And this, I regret to say, is the fact of the case, and it is just unfortunate. It's unfortunate for the working people in the country. I better stop there. Thank you.